Zappa's melodies have a reputation for being dense, angular and complex, and for demanding a high level of technical skill from the performer to successfully navigate their winding, unforgiving terrain. This reputation isn't altogether unfounded, but Zappa's melodies can sometimes sound a little more intimidating and complex than they actually are. In this video, I will approach some of Zappa's apparent methods for approaching melody by using two case studies, and I will briefly explain how I have dealt with similar techniques in order to demonstrate how you might apply these methods in your own music. The two melodies I am going to examine are RDNZL and Rollo Interior. But first, let's briefly examine Zappa's background. Having cultivated an early interest in 20th century chamber music, a passion of Zappa's which had been sparked by an extremely negative review of an Edgar Varese record, which, incidentally, was conducted by future collaborator Nicholas Tchernimsky, Frank seemed quite disinterested in older forms of classical music, which he acknowledged during a concert he staged in LA at the age of 23.
I know absolutely nothing about any composers before the 20th century. I have a very unusual type musical background. It's practically nil. My own personal tastes and what I listen to do not include very much tonal music of that type.
This is apparently reflected in his music, which shows few indications of him having assimilated functional harmony into his tonal language, though having become familiar with at least some of Walter Piston's book Harmony during his time as a student, he had at least some knowledge of it, even if he reacted against its principles. As such, he turned to his more contemporary influences for ideas and began writing 12-tone music, such as Waltz No. 1 for guitar. He described the trajectory of this period himself.
All through high school I was writing serial music, and I thought that was really the way to go because it was all provable by mathematics, and you'd know right away how much your music was worth by figuring out whether or not you had all the notes in the right places, and it was really intellectual. Then I heard what some of the stuff sounded like that I had been writing, and it was so ugly, I decided to go backwards and get into the melodic area again. And then people started telling me that my melodies were ugly. So I guess I'm successful.
Disillusioned with the rigidity of dodecaphony, it seems like he began to draw upon his non-serialist influences, among which were Igor Stravinsky and Bela Bartok. Both of these composers made extensive use of folk melodies. Bartok was an ethnomusicologist who documented European vernacular songs, and Stravinsky routinely pilfered Russian folk melodies, which he would quote and dismember in his music. Interestingly, Zappa's music is highly modal, and much of it would use odd meters, both things that he had in common with these two composers, who he acknowledged as great influences. So how did all these influences manifest in Zappa's music? Let's have a look at the melody from RDNZL. This melody was written into a section which was initially intended as a space for soloists to improvise. Kurt Morgan, former handler of Frank's original scores for the Zappa Family Trust and current electric bassist with the Dweezil Zappa Band, described to me the recollection of Ruth Underwood, one of Zappa's earliest percussionists. Ruth had been refusing to improvise despite Frank's efforts to encourage her to do so, and so one day, exasperated, Frank took out some manuscripts during a rehearsal and jotted down a melody for her to play there and then. This melody would become a mainstay for all later versions of the piece. First, let's outline the melody's primary features. I will be looking at the version from the early 1970s. Slight changes were made to the melody in later versions, which I won't address in this video. It is highly conjunct, favouring stepwise movements which target chord tones. It is mainly diatonic. Chromaticisms used for colour, but they always resolve to a chord tone. It follows a theme and variation format, transposing and developing a handful of simple melodic ideas. It consistently relies on a call and response phrase structure, controlling the contours and trajectories of the steady stream of eighth notes. Keep in mind those overarching features while I make chronological observations from the beginning of the melody to the end of the melody. Zappa sets up a call and response between two 4-bar phrases in C Ionian. Bars 1 to 4 see the melody peak, with the range between the lowest and highest notes in the phrase being a major ninth. The response in bars 5 to 8 sees a smaller range of a fifth. In bar 4, the high B, which in this instance is the 7th, sets up a tension which is resolved to the 6th in bar 8. The shape of this contour, I would argue, is defined by the restriction on the range's bandwidth in the response phrase, as this transformation funnels the melody towards the more stepwise material that follows this phrase. In terms of rhythm, this theme depends on longer note durations, which differentiate it from the persistent stream of eighths which characterise most of the rest of the material. Bar 9 sees an A-flat Ionian tonality established over a B-flat pedal. Bar 10 sees some harmonic planing, with the modes native E-flat and B-flat being chromatically shifted up to E natural and B natural, alluding to G-sharp Aeolian, before these are shifted back down to their flat counterparts. Bar 11 sees the introduction of a descending chromatic idea, manoeuvring from the first degree to the flat 7, and bar 12 sees the D-flat altered to become a D natural, hinting at a Lydian tonality, although this could probably be more simply considered a transposition of the D-flat to C-cell from bar 11. Bars 9 to 12 constitute the first phrase in the 8-bar call and response structure, and point towards the peak of this melodic phrase, which occurs in bar 14. Bars 13 to 14 see the introduction of a phrase which sees a scalic descent into the next octave, where the phrase is repeated verbatim in bars 15 to 16. These phrases can be firmly categorized as B-flat Ionian, and are thus entirely diatonic, contrasting with the previous chromatic ideas. Bars 17 to 24 see a variant of the first theme, transposed to D Ionian. The superimposition of a C major chord over the D pedal, combined with the F sharp in the melody, alludes to a Lydian tonality. This additional harmonic tension drives the phrase towards the next section. Bars 25 to 32 seem to be a variation of and response to bars 9 to 16. Bar 26 is similar to bar 10, with the shift to the parallel minor of the established tonality being exploited to produce chromaticisms in the melody. Bar 29 sees a shift to C Ionian, with bar 30 developing a Phrygian idea by superimposing a D-flat figure over the C pedal. By bar 31, everything is back to C Ionian, with the only chromaticism being the deployment of a flat 7 at the end of bar 32. Bars 33 to 36 see a moment of respite from the relentlessly winding melody offered by a repeated E Ionian figure. This, like the initial theme, functions as a point of orientation before veering back off into less predictable territory. Bars 37 to 40 are structurally significant because it is here that the melody begins to work towards its ultimate peak by accessing a higher register via an ascending figure in fourths. The tonality in this section is entirely diatonic. Due to the superimposition of a D major chord over an E pedal, I am tempted to read the melody as being in E mixolydian rather than D Lydian, especially because it can be seen as a modification of the previously established E Ionian tonality. Bars 41 to 44 sees another point of orientation, a variation on the idea in bars 33 to 36. Bars 45 to 48 re-enter the lower register via a scalic descent in D Ionian, giving the melody space to climax. The contrast between the lowest note of this phrase and the leap back up into the higher register serves to emphasize the peak of the melody. Bars 49 to 50 see the peak of the melody. This is emphasized by longer durational values. Bar 51 to 52 see this figure repeated an octave lower, allowing the phrase that follows to access a lower register, and thereby distancing it from the peak, which will allow it to grow one more time before sinking into its lower register and segueing into the next section of the composition. Bars 53 to 56 work towards the melody's final descending scalic figure by gradually ascending by relying on the use of quartal maneuvers to target the higher register. This takes place over a C pedal, entirely diatonically. Bars 57 to 60 simply consist of a descending E-flat mixolydian scale, spanning 3 octaves, which the marimba deals with fine, but this forces the electric bass and synthesizer to displace their parts by an octave in places. The melody ends with a syncopated figure in E Lydian, before segueing into an A Lydian tonality, whereupon Zappa takes a solo. So now let's have a look at Rollo Interior from St. Alfonso's Pancake Breakfast. If we examine its main features, the first thing we notice is that it is structurally uniform. All 3 distinct sections are 8 bars in length. This uniformity is a similarity with RDNZL. We also find a call and response phrase structure, which may account for the uniformity of phrase length, another similarity with RDNZL. But note the use of anacrusic phrases. Sections are clearly marked with a recurring motif of a strongly diatonic character, and which also makes sole use of stepwise movement. This serves to strongly differentiate it from the more angular and chromatic material which surrounds it. Suspended second chord qualities are preferred, and this creates ambiguity with regards to chord functions. Zappa seems to harmonise any given root with the sus2 chord as a colour choice, rather than to alter harmonic function, which can lead to some unusual chords in sections where the melody becomes more chromatic. The melody appears to have been written first, with the chords designed to fit it post hoc, although this is only my speculation. This is because very simple chromatic alterations are used regularly in this melody to generate a sense of instability and thus motion, but this results in some fairly unusual chord combinations. This contrasts with RDNZL, where the chords are known to have existed before the melody. The melody is characterized by juxtapositions between leaps and conjunct lines. It is also characterized by a mixture of diatonicism and chromaticism. Diatonic ideas are chromatically altered and transmuted into more malleable, harmonically ambiguous materials. This melody seems to focus heavily on transformational processes, and is such very horizontal. The melody begins with the diatonic C major phrase, contextualized by a B-flat sus2 over G chord. This seems to suggest that the B-flat sus2 over G is functioning as a G7 chord, meaning that the piece begins in a strong C major tonality but with an immediate instability, apparently immediately preparing to move to a different tonal centre. The G7 moves straight to a C sus2, affecting a kind of perfect cadence. Almost immediately, however, an F sharp is introduced in the melody, although this does not seem to allude to C Lydian, rather it seems to function more to destabilize the C major tonality and bend it towards a more disparate key. The idea from beat 1 is developed on beat 2, the interval of a fourth comprising F sharp and B natural as modified by a half step becoming F natural and B flat, fitting the new chord. Whilst the chord seems distant from the C tonic, this simple melodic alteration clarifies its function. Maintaining a conjunct motion between voices seems to be the main priority, and the manoeuvre from C to G flat succeeds as a consonant accompaniment for the chromatically altered melody whilst allowing smooth voice leading in the harmonies. A G flat sus2 chord, a tritone away from the C major, moves to a D flat sus2 and could be considered to be a transient tonicization of G flat. This chord choice seems to affect the melody by forcing chromatic alterations of previous tones, developing the melody quite radically and quite quickly. The bass line, rather than emphasizing the tonic, functions as a thread through these disparate harmonies, relating them via stepwise motion. The F sus2 chord seems to be a return to the C tonality. The D flat sus2 in bar 7 could be viewed as a Neapolitan chord, borrowed from the G flat tonality, which could now be viewed as a flat 5 chord in relation to the recurring C tonic. All of the chords are diatonic chords from the key of C. The melody here mainly uses chord tones, but bar 8 sees Zappa taking full advantage of the sus2 chord quality. This ambiguity doesn't force him to commit the third degree to any particular quality, enabling him to use a B flat over the G chord. This is modified to become a B natural over the F chord, reinforcing the chromatic ideas that were introduced in bar 4. Bar 11 sees a shift in tonality to what could be broadly described as E flat major. Choosing the E flat instead of the E natural ensures that the new tonal centre isn't too distant from the old centre, but guarantees the availability of new notes which would be considered chromatic in the old key. The melody here reinforces the notion that this is E flat major. Both B flat major and A flat major triads are outlined as descending arpeggios, and these would be chords 5 and 4 respectively in relation to E flat major. Bar 12 sees a shift to A flat, chord 4 in relation to the new tonic, but the newly established tonality is disrupted by a G flat chord. The melody in beat 1 of bar 12 corresponds perfectly with the accompanying A flat chord, being made up exclusively of notes from A flat major, but the E flat is chromatically altered to E natural and is used to pivot into a whole tone scale which mostly corresponds with the accompanying G flat chord, setting up the next few bars of harmonic ambiguity. Through bars 13 to 14, chords diatonic to E flat major are interpolated with chords outside of the key, returning to the instability hinted at in bars 5 to 6. The beginning of bar 13 consists of 3 gestures based on sixths, which are displaced by fourths. This disjunct motion serves to emphasize the harmonic instability and is also a means of structural demarcation, contrasting with the stepwise material which preceded it. Bar 15 settles on B flat sus2, the 5 chord of E flat, preparing to maneuver to a G sus2 chord and returning to the C major tonality. Bar 14 features a descending chromatic cell, which is transposed down a whole step, overlapping with the beginning of bar 15. Structurally, these chromatic cells seem to signpost a move away from the disjunct gestures, and also serve as the melodic climax of this section. They are distanced from the lowest notes of the preceding phrase, and help wind the melody back down to mostly conjunct gestures, leading it towards the B flat chord in bar 15. Bar 16 is a very firm return to the C major tonality, working its way from the root up to the 5th, preparing the entrance of the primary motif. The repeat of the A section is exactly the same as the first iteration. The ascending figure from bars 25 to 26 takes place over an E minor 7 arpeggio, and it uses pitches entirely consistent with the E melodic minor scale. A major second gesture is displaced up by a minor third, and then by a major second for the next 4 cycles until it is displaced by a minor second. The transposition of this simple gesture appears to be strongly locked onto the grid of E minor. The phrase from bars 27 to 28 prepares the retrograde inversion of the first phrase by manoeuvring back towards the F sharp via a phrase which is largely of an E-flat minor character. The phrase in bars 29 to 30 is a clear response to bars 25 to 26, using the same major second gestures. It is a kind of retrograde inversion of the original phrase. It displaces the gestures according to the same E minor grid as before, but this time it is descending rather than ascending. In bars 31 to 32, Zappa makes use of larger intervals in response to the previous highly conjunct phrases. He employs chromaticisms, which in conjunction with the disjunct use of intervals makes any tonal centre ambiguous. This seems to be a climactic destruction of previously established tonalities. Directly succeeding this bold statement is a brief recapitulation of the C major theme, this time with a B flat in the bass. In my last video, I noted Zappa's use of the 7th as the root. This is another example of that same device employed to very much the same effect. The sense of resolution is tempered by the instability of the 7th, compelling the piece towards a new section. It is important to note that although I have appropriated the language of functional analysis in order to draw comparisons between the tonal relationships in Rollo Interior and the tonal relationships found in music outside of Zappa's universe, I don't think Zappa actually thought in terms of functional harmony when writing this piece. Approaching this piece the way I have though, I think is useful for pinpointing exactly where there are general basic key centres and where these key centres shift. I've tried to very broadly map out these tonal behaviours on the score. Surprisingly, you could reduce Rollo to 3 basic tonalities, and these are C major, E flat major, and E minor, which means you could tenuously look at Rollo as being written in C major, with a reference to C minor via modal mixture. However, looking at it like this ignores a lot of significant harmonic detail, and I would only really take this view in order to try and broadly understand the global form of the piece. So to reiterate, RDNZL is a very diatonic piece, but it's also very transpositional, by which I mean it uses tonal centres, but they move around quite a lot without preparation. The melody is quite heavily reliant on chord tones and on scales which are quite conventionally related to the chord types featured in this section, and as such it's very easy to see it as quite a vertical piece. In contrast, Rollo Interior is quite horizontal in nature. It's driven forwards by chromatic alterations to small note cells, and although it does make use of clear triadic arpeggios and diatonic phrases as points of reorientation, it's not a markedly diatonic piece. There are shared features though. Both Rollo and RDNZL use diatonic phrases as points of reorientation, and both do vary cells via the use of chromaticism, although Rollo relies much more heavily on this device in order to drive the line. Both of these pieces are interesting studies in melody, especially since their lack of rhythmic variation shifts focus more towards techniques of pitch transformation. To demonstrate how some of these techniques might be applied, I will examine a passage from one of my own pieces. This passage is a kind of a hybrid between the Rollo and RDNZL approaches. I didn't specifically write it as a study of any of these ideas in particular, but Zappa probably did subconsciously influence how I went about handling the materials, as I have spent a lot of time transcribing, analysing and absorbing Zappa's melodic style. This passage is in the middle of an arch form composition, serving as an interlude between the repeated sections. I intended this section to be a condensed expression of the thematic material, decorated with elaborations on this material, so I took the harmonic structure from the A section and modified the rhythmic character of the melody and the bass line. This passage is introduced with a new melody superimposed over familiar chords. In this sense, it is similar to RDNZL, as it mainly uses chord tones, although it differs slightly because the harmonic rhythm is more rapid than that in RDNZL, meaning I have less time to explore the scales compatible with each chord, which acts upon the melody by forcing certain chromatic shifts to fit each new chord. The similar melody which follows is derived directly from the A section of the piece. It is largely identical to the original material, but is transformed by rhythmic diminution, the shortening of the note's durational value. It is followed by an elaboration which inverts its phrase contours and introduces more chromatic material. The notes still shift with the chords, so there is still some trace of the RDNZL approach, but the chromatic alteration of certain notes and cells is more characteristic of Rollo, and, like Zappa, I outline recognisable triads which function as little points of orientation. The reason I consider this a hybrid approach is because I built the initial melodic material exclusively out of chord tones, and I don't think this is a trait of Rollo Interior, but characteristically I think this piece bears little resemblance to RDNZL. Having just edited the score examples of the piece I just examined, I've actually realised that I think the first example was actually more like Rollo, and the second example I looked at was actually more similar to RDNZL rather than vice versa. But both sections contain traits of both pieces, and the approaches to writing aren't that different anyway. They're actually quite similar, so it doesn't really matter. Hopefully this was a useful analysis, but if you have a different perspective on these pieces than what I do, please let me know. Also, let me know how you feel about the format. I wanted to use these pieces to explore a topic rather than just looking at them simply for what they are, because ultimately the purpose of analysis is to inform practice. I have produced what I believe to be a highly accurate transcription of the ending of Rollo, which repurposes some of the melodies from Rollo Interior and places them into a more contrapuntal texture. I expect this to be my next analysis and will begin working on it once I have finished my next video, which I plan on being about approaches to compositional form and their relationships to ideas in music cognition. If you're mainly interested in the Zappa stuff, I'd still recommend subscribing even though it's not going to be my exclusive focus, because I will be examining his work often, and the more we can build profile, the more we can promote a good standard of technical discussion about the world's finest optional entertainment. And finally, you can find the link to the unabridged version of my piece, The Night Tonight with Miroslav Borislav, in the description. I implore you to purchase it, but it's free to stream because I know you're all cheap